There are nights when the wind itself seems to remember. It moves through the valleys like an old voice, slow, uncertain, carrying echoes of a world that once breathed warmth. Beneath its whisper, the earth lies still. The snow has covered everything. The bones of trees, the outlines of forgotten homes, the last trails of animals that once sought shelter. The air is thin and sharp, every breath a faint shimmer of frost. Listen closely. Even silence has a texture here. It is heavy, layered, like the weight of 1,000 winters pressing down at once. Somewhere in that silence, a question lingers. What was the deadliest winter the world has ever known? Some would say it was the year 536. Others speak of later centuries, of the little ice age that stole summers from Europe and turned rivers into glass. But perhaps, long before we had words to measure suffering, before calendars and chronicles, there was another winter. One that nearly ended us before history began. We don't know its name. We only know its breath. The story begins not in fear, but in stillness. Imagine waking to a world without sunrise. The sky is not black, but a dull, ashen grey. A sky that feels exhausted, as if the light has been swallowed, and only its memory remains. You step outside, expecting morning, yet the air remains frozen in perpetual twilight. The snow beneath your feet glows faintly, reflecting a colourless light from a sun you cannot see. The world has entered a pause, a breath between what was and what will be. It is strange how quickly the body forgets warmth. At first you remember it, the way sunlight once touched your skin, the way rivers once moved without ice. But after a few weeks of endless cold, the memory fades. Warmth becomes myth, something spoken of in whispers, a story parents tell their children beside dying embers. And soon, the embers too begin to fade. In the chronicles of the Byzantine Empire, a historian named Procopius wrote of this time. He said, "The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year." Imagine reading those words by candlelight, centuries later, trying to picture what he saw. A sun that rose each morning only to fail, weak, uncertain, colourless. Far away in China, the court astronomers recorded the same thing. Frost in summer, failed harvests, a strange dimness that lingered over the empire. And in Ireland, monks wrote of bread running out, of famine, of the year when a failure of bread swept the land. Different languages, different faiths, one shared silence, the kind only the earth itself could create. It is hard for us to imagine such a silence now. Our nights are filled with hums and lights, engines and electric suns. But there was a time when the only illumination came from fire and the faint shimmer of ice. The people of that forgotten winter lived by glow, the glow of coals, of faith, of each other's breath. In that dimness, time began to slow. Days and nights blurred together, marked not by clocks but by hunger. The rhythm of life itself faltered. Birds vanished, crops failed, people began to move, villages abandoned, roads filling with footprints that led nowhere. The world, it seemed, had begun to unmake itself. Yet beneath that desolation, something ancient stirred, a memory of survival older than civilization, because humanity has seen winters before, and somehow, always, we have learned to endure them. Long before the year 536, long before the fall of empires, there was another winter, older, deeper, and darker. Around 74,000 years ago, the sky itself was torn open by the eruption of Mount Toba. The explosion cast more ash into the atmosphere than any volcano since. The world dimmed for years, temperatures fell. Some scientists believe the human population dwindled to a mere few thousand. Small groups huddled in caves, wrapped in furs, tending to flickers of fire that might not last the night. Imagine them, a family beside a smoky fire, a mother whispering to her child about the days when the sky was blue, the sound of wind outside, not as music but as threat, each dawn uncertain, each night endless. Perhaps that was the deadliest winter, not just for its cold, but for what it demanded: faith, imagination, the will to believe that warmth would return. Because every winter, no matter how long, is a test of belief. Modern scientists call it a volcanic winter, a term clean and clinical, stripped of emotion. But what it truly meant was this: the Earth lost its balance. Dust and sulfur filled the stratosphere, reflecting sunlight away. The sky turned grey, then bronze, then something in between. Crops failed, oceans cooled, and life, the fragile weave of it, began to unravel. We think of extinction as sudden, but it is often slow. It begins not with fire but with frost, not with noise but with silence. And yet, even in that silence, something endured. There were seeds buried deep beneath snow. There were animals that learned to sleep through the cold, hearts slowing but not stopping. There were humans who gathered around stories. Because sometimes, the telling of a story is enough to keep the dark away. When the darkness is long enough, you begin to see differently. The stars seem closer, brighter, more patient. The sound of ice cracking across a frozen lake becomes the heartbeat of the world itself. There is fear, yes, but also awe. You begin to realize that winter is not death. It is memory made visible. Every flake of snow is a memory of water, stilled in mid-air. Every frozen branch remembers the green it once held. Every breath you see is proof that something living remains. That too is survival, not defiance, but endurance. As centuries passed, humans gave these winters names. The year without summer, the great frost, the little ice age. But before names, there was only the feeling, the knowing that something vast had shifted, that the sun had withdrawn its favor, and the earth was holding its breath. Somewhere in a monastery, a monk wrote prayers into the margin of a fading manuscript. Somewhere in Scandinavia, a hunter carved strange symbols into bone. Somewhere in Central America, a temple was left unfinished, its stones frozen mid-construction. Each mark, each story, is a small defiance against the cold. There's an odd comfort in realizing that our ancestors faced such winters and still looked to the stars. When all else failed, when fields froze, when gods were silent, when firewood ran out, they tilted their heads upward and waited, not just for warmth, but for meaning. They saw in the dim sun a lesson, that life, however fragile, refuses to end quietly. And perhaps that's why we still talk about these winters. Not to remember suffering, but to honor survival. The human story is not one of endless summer. It is a story of returning light. Every civilization, every myth, every dawn begins with darkness. If you listen carefully to the wind on a winter night, you can still hear it, the echo of that ancient cold. It whispers through the branches, over frozen rivers, across mountain passes, once buried in ash. It says, remember, remember, the hunger, the waiting, the silence. Remember how close the world came to stillness, and how somehow the heart kept beating. The night the world froze was not a single night. It was a season stretched across years, an age that tested every form of life that dared to breathe. But it ended, the sky cleared, the snow began to melt, the sun, shy and pale, rose once more over the horizon. And when its first light touched the ice, it glittered, as if the world itself exhaled. The deadliest winter is not a chapter of history, it is a mirror. It asks us how much warmth we truly carry inside us. It reminds us that civilization rests on fragile ground, a thin layer of warmth between fire and frost, and it leaves us with a question that hums quietly beneath every human heart. How close did we come to never seeing spring again? The year was 536, a year that began like any other, with trade ships on the seas, smoke curling from hearths and fields waiting for spring. But before long, something strange began to happen. The light changed. The mornings grew dimmer. The days shorter, not by time but by colour. The world had not yet realised that it was entering one of the darkest ages in all of recorded history. It began, as such things often do, with quiet confusion. In Constantinople, merchants looked toward the east and saw a strange pall over the rising sun. The emperor's courtiers whispered that perhaps it was an omen, a warning from heaven. In distant Ireland, monks recorded in their annals that a failure of bread swept through the land, and across the wide empire of China, court astronomers wrote in trembling brushstrokes that the sun became dim, shadows disappeared. Everywhere, the same story. The light had grown tired. For 18 months, the sun gave no warmth, no brilliance, no certainty. It still rose, yes, but only as a pale imitation of itself. Imagine it. Daylight that felt like dusk, skies that carried the colour of old parchment, and the endless sense that something had gone profoundly wrong with the world. Procopius, a historian in the service of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, left behind words that have haunted scholars ever since. He wrote, "During this year, a most dread portent took place. The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year." Even in translation, you can hear the unease, a man of reason searching for words to describe something beyond reason. It wasn't only Procopius. In Syria, Michael the Syrian would later echo the same account. The sun was dark, and its darkness lasted for 18 months. Each day it shone for about 4 hours, but this light was only a feeble shadow. From Europe to Asia, the earth seemed to have lost its star. What does a world do when its sun disappears, yet the sky remains unbroken? There were no explosions, no fire from above, no divine thunder, only a steady, colourless dimming, the kind that seeps into the soul. Farmers waited for dawns that never brightened. The soil, cold and unyielding, refused to wake. Wheat failed, vines withered. Even in midsummer, frost gathered on the edges of leaves. The air itself felt unfamiliar, dry, metallic, as if the earth had stopped breathing. The old rhythm of life, seed to harvest, day to night, faltered, and with it, faith began to tremble. In China, imperial officials recorded famine across the northern provinces. Chronicles from the Nanshe tell of snow falling in August, of rivers freezing too soon. Yellow dust, they wrote, rained from the sky. People thought it was punishment, an omen of imbalance between heaven and earth. In Europe, the winter lingered. The sea ice expanded far beyond its usual bounds. The people of Scandinavia saw their crops perish. In Ireland, the Annals of Ulster note a simple, devastating line: a failure of bread in the year 536. Brief words for a long hunger. The strange part was that no one knew why. There was no single event to point to, no comet or war, only the slow encroachment of grey. The world had been dimmed by something unseen. A veil drawn across the heavens. In Constantinople, priests led processions through the streets, carrying relics, praying for mercy. In India, the monsoon rains failed, and the sacred rivers fell to their lowest levels in memory. The Maya in Central America carved new rituals into stone, their calendars trembling in uncertainty. The silence of the skies echoed everywhere. Modern science, centuries later, would find the evidence hidden deep within ice. In cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica, scientists found a thin layer of volcanic glass and sulfur, a frozen fingerprint of catastrophe. 2 eruptions, perhaps more, had filled the stratosphere with fine ash and aerosols. These particles scattered sunlight, turning day into twilight and plunging the planet into a chill that would last decades. But to the people who lived through it, there was no such explanation. There was only the feeling that the world itself had turned away from them. Picture a morning in that dim year. A farmer stands beside his frozen field. The sun is a faint circle above him, dull and white, casting no shadow. The snow crunches beneath his boots, not because it is winter, but because the earth has forgotten how to thaw. His breath clouds in front of him, and he looks up, expecting warmth, but finds only silence. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rings. Not for worship, but for a funeral. And in that moment, the sound seems to carry through all of human history. The toll of fragility, the realization that life depends on a fragile balance between fire and frost. The year 536 became more than a date. It became a threshold, a dividing line between memory and myth. Historians would later call the period that followed the Dark Age, but perhaps it was literally dark. In the years after the light dimmed, entire economies crumbled. Trade routes fell silent. The Byzantine Empire, though still powerful, began to weaken. In the far north, entire settlements vanished. But even amid collapse, life continued. People adapted. They built smaller fires, stored food differently, told new stories about the sun. Stories where light was a god in exile, a promise waiting to return. It is strange how the human heart persists, even when the sky does not. Not all chronicles are full of despair. Some are quiet, almost resigned. In the Chronicle of Edessa, a scribe notes, "The stars appeared at midday." The line is short, almost beautiful in its simplicity. He does not rage or question, he merely records. There is wisdom in that simplicity. Sometimes survival means noticing, bearing witness, writing a sentence so that someone, centuries later, might remember that the world once dimmed and still survived. And yet, as the dimness stretched into a second year, even the most faithful began to lose hope. The harvests failed again. Livestock died. People wandered from one region to another, chasing rumors of warmth. Across the northern world, famine took hold. Skeletons found in burials from this period show the signs: malnutrition, stress, abrupt endings. There are no songs from this time, or if there were, they've been lost. Only the records remain, faint and factual, like the echo of a whisper in stone. The sun still rose, yes, but the world no longer trusted it. That was perhaps the deepest wound. Not the cold, not the hunger, but the betrayal of light itself. For all of human memory, the sun had been constant. Empires fell, rivers changed course, gods rose and vanished. But the sun always returned. Until it didn't. When faith in the sun falters, faith in everything else begins to tremble. If even daylight can lie, what else might vanish? People prayed harder. Others turned away from prayer entirely. Philosophers wrote about cycles and omens, about endings and renewals. The darkness became a mirror for the mind, a question of what endures when the most certain thing fades. And still, somewhere far above, the earth was cloaked in its volcanic veil, a gossamer shroud of ash circling the globe. Invisible to the eyes of those below, yet powerful enough to change everything they knew. That veil was the bridge between science and myth. To those who endured it, it was divine wrath or cosmic punishment. To us, it is chemistry and atmosphere. But to the earth itself, it was simply balance. The exhale after fire. The frost reached into summer and then into autumn again. In Scandinavia, archaeologists find signs that whole communities vanished around this time. Some believe they migrated south, others that they perished quietly in the cold. The Norse myths that would later speak of Fimbulwinter, the great winter before the end of the world, may have been born from memories of these very years. Stories, after all, are how we carry pain safely across generations. By 538, the light began to return faintly. The sky brightened, though never quite as before. The world, scarred but enduring, exhaled. Yet the damage was done. Crops had failed for too long. Populations had thinned. And in the years that followed, new terrors would come. Plague, war, and the slow unraveling of empires. But that is for another night. For now, picture this. A dawn breaking over the ancient world. Pale and fragile after 18 months of twilight, the light falls on empty fields, on ruins, on the quiet faces of those who survived. They lift their heads and blink against it, uncertain. Is it truly over? Can the world trust the sun again? Science gives us answers. History gives us context. But it is imagination that gives us empathy, that allows us to stand with those who lived through a sun without light and feel their breath in the cold. For though the centuries have passed, the lesson remains. Even when the sky grows dim, the heart remembers the shape of brightness, and perhaps that memory, fragile, trembling, but alive, is what saved us. Before the sky dimmed, the world was alive with colour. It is easy to forget that. When we speak of darkness, we often forget the light that came before it, the sounds, the movement, the ordinary rhythm of days. In the early years of the 6th century, the earth was not silent. It pulsed with the quiet confidence of empires and fields and seas that believed the sun would always return. Let us begin there, in the warmth, before the fall. The ports of the Byzantine Empire shimmered with life. In Constantinople, sails unfurled like wings against the golden morning. Ships creaked in their moorings, heavy with silk, spices and promise. The sea was blue then, a living mirror beneath a sky so bright it hurt to look at for too long. Dockworkers shouted over the din of gulls. Merchants haggled in half a dozen tongues. And the air was sweet with the scent of olive oil and salt. Inside the city walls, mosaics glimmered in candlelight. Saints and emperors made of glass and gold, frozen mid-blessing. The empire was vast, proud, and sure of its own continuity. To those who lived beneath that sun, history seemed stable. Every day began as the last had ended, with light. Far to the north, beyond the reach of marble and empire, the world was quieter, but no less certain. In the green valleys of Scandinavia, farmers walked barefoot through damp fields. They turned the soil with wooden ploughs, humming songs that had no name. The earth smelled rich and alive. Children chased each other through birch groves. Smoke curled lazily from hearths. The seasons still kept their promise then. Winter would come, fierce and cold, but it would leave in time. And when the first meltwater trickled down from the hills, it felt like forgiveness. The people counted the months not by fear, but by expectation. Lambing, sowing, harvest, rest. The sky was a trusted clock. Across the western seas in Ireland, the monks of Clonmac Noir traced their prayers onto vellum, their script a river of black ink flowing across pale skin. Outside the stone walls of their monastery, the Shannon glittered. Cattle grazed on wide fields, and the rhythm of bells marked time, the slow turning of hours that seemed infinite. Trade routes stretched farther than any one mind could truly imagine. From Ireland to the Frankish kingdoms, from Italy to the deserts of Arabia, caravans carried glass and wool and stories. Even the farthest corners of the known world were bound together by the same golden thread. Sunlight. It lit their paths, guided their ships, and gave weight to their faith. In the east, beyond Constantinople's splendor, the Persian Empire breathed in its own radiance. In Ctesiphon, gardens bloomed beside the Tigris. The courtyards were filled with pomegranate trees, heavy with fruit, fountains whispering in the heat. Scholars gathered in shaded halls, debating philosophy, medicine, and the movement of stars. They wrote of the sun with reverence, as the eye of Ahura Mazda, the eternal flame. The world, they believed, moved by divine symmetry, and so it did, for a while. The year before the ash fell, there was no warning. The earth's heart beat steadily. Volcanoes smoked in distant lands, but that was nothing unusual. The world has always breathed fire beneath its skin. What no one knew was that deep beneath the crust, pressure was building. Somewhere, perhaps in the far northern seas, perhaps in the tropics, magma surged upward, whispering to the sky in a language no human could hear. But for now, above ground, everything remained gentle. In the markets of Antioch, figs and honeycomb were stacked in neat pyramids. Children ran between stalls, their laughter blending with the clatter of copper coins. In the farmlands of Gaul, shepherds lifted their faces to the sun and felt its warmth on their skin. An ordinary, fleeting moment, made eternal by what would come next. And in the Far East, in the rice paddies of China, farmers knelt ankle-deep in mud, planting the seeds of another good year. Everywhere, there was rhythm, predictable, trusted, human. It is that rhythm, more than anything, that defines civilization. The expectation that tomorrow will look much like today. But history has a cruel kindness. It lets us forget the fragility of that rhythm until it chooses to break it. The first signs were subtle. A strange haze on the horizon, a morning that felt colder than it should, a sunrise that lingered behind a thin veil of grey. People noticed, of course, but they always find explanations. Dust storms, strange winds, divine moods, nothing to worry about. But the birds began to vanish. They were the first to sense it. Their songs thinned from the forests. Their migration paths faltered. Fishermen at sea spoke of gulls that disappeared mid-journey, of silence falling over the waves. And then came the frost. It was the kind that settled too early, that bit at buds still forming on the branch. The farmers stared at their fields and felt something unfamiliar rise in their chests. Not fear yet, but unease. The sun rose, but it didn't feel like morning anymore. In Constantinople, the marble gleamed a little less brightly. The emperor's astrologers charted the skies and found omens where once there were patterns. Markets grew quieter. Ships returned with smaller loads. It happened slowly, like a shadow stretching across the world. Even the air seemed to change. The light no longer carried warmth. It was pale, diluted, as if the sun had withdrawn slightly, unsure whether to stay. People began to notice that the colours around them had faded. Blues became grey. Gold turned to ash. The sea lost its sparkle, and when the rains came, they lingered. Not cleansing, but cold, heavy, endless. There's a kind of dread that builds not in moments, but in weeks. At first the world adjusts. People add another log to the fire, eat from their stored grain, whisper that the season will pass. But deep down something begins to shift. A subtle recognition that the pattern, the one they have built their lives upon, may not hold. The certainty of the sun had been humanity's oldest promise. Now, that promise began to tremble. Farmers in Scandinavia watched their herds thin. The monks in Ireland recorded strange weather in their careful Latin. Persian scholars noted that the stars looked dimmer. And in Constantinople, a merchant returning from the north told of forests buried in frost. In May. Each story added to a quiet dread that spread faster than the cold itself. We rarely notice the moment normalcy begins to slip away. It happens softly, like breath fading into fog. One morning, the world still hums with ordinary life. The next, the silence feels too deep, too absolute. When the wind changed direction, people thought little of it. When the crops began to fail, they prayed. When the birds stopped singing altogether, they finally began to listen. Archaeologists today uncover their silence in fragments, a seed that never sprouted, a hearth left cold, a letter unfinished. What they cannot unearth is the feeling, that strange, collective heartbeat of confusion that must have spread as the world dimmed. We, who live beneath electric suns and satellites, can hardly imagine it, a whole planet realizing at once that the light could vanish, but they felt it in their bones. The Byzantine mosaics that once caught the sun's brilliance began to look dull. The golden tesserae reflected nothing but shadow. In the north, frost gathered on the lips of rivers that should have been flowing freely. The monks in Ireland wrote of a dimness in the sky. The farmers in China recorded summer frost. Everywhere, the same refrain, the light has changed. And with it, something within humanity changed as well. We live beneath a fragile sun. It is easy to forget that. To assume that light is infinite, that warmth is owed, that morning will always follow night. But the earth remembers. It remembers the years when dawn hesitated, when fire hid behind ash, when the living world paused between breaths. That fragility is the quiet heartbeat beneath every story of survival. It hums beneath the soil, beneath the sea, beneath our own skin. We build our cities, our faiths, our futures on the promise of light. But that promise is as thin as the air at dawn. When the last ordinary sunrise came, no one knew it would be the last. That morning looked like all the others. Merchants setting sail, farmers turning earth, children laughing in the fields. The same rhythm, the same sound of life. And then, the next day, the light was gone. No explosion, no roar. Just a soft, endless dimming. The world exhaling into shadow. For centuries, people would wonder what happened. Some would call it punishment. Others would seek reason in the stars or omens in the flight of birds. But the truth was simpler, colder, quieter. The earth had drawn its veil, and for the first time in human memory, daylight could no longer be trusted. We live beneath a fragile sun, one heartbeat away from stillness. There are moments in Earth's history when the planet seems to take a deep, violent breath, and then exhale ash. Long before anyone wrote the year 536, the world beneath our feet was already shifting, preparing to whisper its anger into the sky. The surface was calm, green fields, cold seas, quiet mornings. But beneath that stillness, pressure built in darkness. Miles below the crust, magma moved like blood beneath skin, slow, patient, unstoppable. And then, somewhere, the earth tore open. No one saw the beginning. No chronicler was there to record the first plume, the first trembling of rock. Yet every human who lived afterward carried its shadow. Perhaps it began in the north, in Iceland, where fire sleeps beneath ice. Imagine that moment. A crack splitting through a glacier, molten rock surging upward, steam rising like a ghost as the sea boiled and the sky filled with thunder. Lightning flashed through the ash cloud, white veins in a body of smoke. The sound was beyond thunder, a roar so deep it silenced everything around it. And then, as quickly as it began, the light dimmed. Ash met air, air met wind. The wind carried it everywhere. Volcanic ash is not like ordinary dust. It is glass, fine, sharp, alive. It drifts for miles, climbing higher and higher until it reaches the stratosphere. There it spreads, thin and invisible, like the unfurling of a shroud. At first, it looks beautiful. The sunsets blaze with unnatural color, crimson, violet, deep indigo. But beauty has always been the disguise of catastrophe. For each brilliant dusk, the world beneath grows colder. High above the earth, microscopic crystals of sulfuric acid scatter sunlight, sending it back into space. The warmth that once bathed the seas and soil now dissolves into the void. The scientists at Harvard, Uppsala, and Berkeley would one day find proof of this. Thin lines of sulfur frozen deep in polar ice. Each layer a page in the diary of the world. Two spikes stand out, one in the year 536, another just a few years later in 540. Two breaths of fire, separated by silence. Together they cloak the planet in shadow, but the people who lived then knew nothing of aerosols or albedo. They knew only that the world had changed, that the air smelled of dust and the light had grown weak. In the north, snow fell red. The ash that drifted down carried iron from the volcano's heart, tinting the fields as though the earth itself bled. In the east, the monsoon failed. The rains came too late or not at all. Crops withered. And across Europe, summer felt like autumn, and autumn like death. Imagine standing there, at the edge of that eruption before the world knew its name. You are a fisherman on a northern shore. The morning sky is grey, the sea restless. Then, a sound, deep, unending, rolls across the water. You look to the horizon and see a column rising, black and alive, climbing higher than any mountain. The air grows heavy, the light strange. Birds scatter. The sea begins to steam. And as you turn toward the land, you realize the day has vanished. Even in daylight, you can see the stars. Volcanoes are paradoxes. They destroy, but they also create. The same fire that scorches the sky will one day form fertile soil. But in the moment of eruption, there is no creation, only chaos. The Earth's own lungs filling with smoke. The ash drifted outward, circling the globe in days. It settled into the atmosphere like an unseen ocean, turning sunlight into shadow. The veil had descended. It would not lift for years. Scientists today can still read its traces. In Greenland's ice cores, the year 536 glows faintly with sulfur, a ghost of ancient fire preserved beneath millennia of snow. Researchers from Uppsala University drilled deep, counting the years like rings of a tree until they reached the layer that marked the darkness. The chemistry was unmistakable. Sulfate and glass, signatures of a massive eruption. But the ice told another story too, of silence that followed. For even after the eruption ceased, the world did not heal. 4 years later, another explosion, perhaps in the tropics, added its own shadow to the sky. The world, already shrouded, was smothered again. In the centuries that followed, poets would call it divine wrath. But the earth does not rage. It simply resets. When the balance tips, when pressure grows unbearable, it releases. In Iceland, the volcanoes are called eldfjöll, fire mountains. They do not sleep. They only wait. Beneath their frozen slopes, magma moves like thought, unseen, constant, ancient. One such mountain, scientists believe, could have been the source of 536. An eruption so vast, it tore through glaciers, sending ash and steam into the stratosphere. Others point south, to El Salvador's Ilopango, or Indonesia's Rabaul. Each theory carries its own poetry, its own geography of destruction. But all lead to the same truth. The veil did not rise from one place. It rose from the earth itself. From the perspective of the sky, the change was delicate, a faint haze spreading across continents. But down below, it was total. Temperatures fell by more than 2 degrees. Crops failed in China, in Britain, in Ethiopia. Tree rings from North America show stunted growth. A whole forest paused in shock. The pattern was global, precise, inescapable. The world was cooling, not by season, but by decree. Lightning danced inside the ash clouds, arcing between particles like fire trapped in smoke. It is said that thunder from a great eruption can circle the planet twice before fading. Perhaps the people who lived then heard echoes of it long after the mountain fell silent. A low tremor beneath their prayers, a sound that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. In that sound, they might have imagined gods at war. We, knowing more, imagine physics. But the awe is the same. Ash fell into oceans, spreading in soft ribbons across the waves. The sea surface cooled. Coral reefs, fragile and luminous, began to bleach. The rhythm of the world's waters changed. Winds shifted. The Indian monsoon weakened. In the far north, the ice thickened early. Every system, atmospheric, biological, human, began to echo the same imbalance. And yet, the eruption itself may have lasted only days. A few brief days to unmake years of warmth. There is a strange beauty in catastrophe seen from a distance. Scientists describe the process with care. Sulfur dioxide oxidizing into sulfate, forming aerosols, scattering shortwave radiation. The language is cold, but the reality is not. It is red snow and dark noon. It is breath turned to frost, and silence where birds once sang. It is the realization that we live at the mercy of invisible layers, thin membranes of air that decide whether the world burns or freezes. When the veil first descended, the people of 536 did not know its cause, but they knew its weight. Daylight became strange, the sun a pale disk, the moon a blurred echo, the stars faded behind dust. Even time itself seemed altered. Days felt shorter not because they were, but because the light no longer measured them faithfully. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian, ruling from Constantinople, sent word to his provinces, relief for famine, prayer for deliverance. But no policy could command the sky. The veil was everywhere and nowhere. In a world without modern science, there was no framework to explain the unseeable. People turned to myth, to prayer, to fear. They blamed comets, divine punishment, even sorcery. But what truly frightened them was not understanding. To live beneath a dimmed sun is to feel abandoned. To wake each morning and see the world grayer than before. That is a kind of loneliness that no language captures. And still, life continued. Fires were lit, children were born, songs were sung softly in the dark. We often imagine catastrophe as noise, as explosion, as chaos, but the veil descended quietly. It was the silence afterward that lasted. The pause between breaths, the stillness of a planet waiting for light. And while volcanoes tore mountains apart, humanity stood small and still, watching the sky fade. That helplessness is part of our history too. The knowledge that the earth does not bend to our rhythm, that it turns and trembles on its own time. In the end, the veil thinned, but it never truly left. Its echoes lingered for generations, in famine, in myth, in the genetic memory of survival. Even today, in ice buried deep within Antarctica, that veil is preserved, a grey ribbon marking the moment when the world dimmed. The scientists who study it touch those layers with reverence. To them, it is not just data, it is a whisper from the past. The memory of fire turned to shadow. They measure the sulfur, the temperature, the dust, but what they are really measuring is fragility. When molten rock met sea, the world changed. When ash met air, the sky forgot how to shine. And when the veil descended, humankind learned, quietly, painfully, that it had never truly been in control. Because beneath our fields and cities, beneath our faiths and futures, the earth is always waiting, breathing, listening, preparing its next whisper of fire. When the veil descended, the world forgot its rhythm. There was no spring, only a long grey pause between dying winter and a summer that never came. For the first time in memory, time itself felt wrong. The months no longer meant what they used to. Calendars became ornaments, not promises. The world had slipped out of tune. In Constantinople, merchants watched the harbours freeze earlier than ever before. Ships that once carried olive oil and silk now sat trapped in the brittle ice. Along the Rhine, farmers waited for thaw that never came, their hands cracked and bleeding from the cold. And far to the east, in the hills of China, scribes recorded the impossible, frost in midsummer, crops that died before they ripened. One court record from 536 speaks quietly. The sun shone faintly as through smoke. Snow fell in the 5th month. The fields bore no grain. Even on the other side of the world, the same confusion echoed. In the Americas, inscriptions on Mayan stelae falter. Years once marked with confidence give way to silence. The rains had failed, and with them, the order of life. Imagine the weight of that stillness. A farmer wakes before dawn. He walks into a field that no longer belongs to him. Though his family has tended it for generations, the soil, once warm and black, now lies stiff and grey, thinly crusted with frost. He kneels, touches the ground and feels nothing but cold. Above him, the sky is pale, not white, not blue, but colourless, like bone. There are no birds, no buzzing of insects, no sound at all, save for the faint cracking of ice deep within the soil. He stays there for a while, listening, as though the earth might answer him, but the earth is silent. In monasteries across Europe, monks began to write by candlelight. They wrote of hunger, of blight, of skies without brightness. They noted how the sun seemed weak, as if seen through a veil of smoke, and how each year grew colder, meaner. In Ireland, annals recorded famine so severe that entire villages vanished from record. In Scandinavia, tree rings show a story the scribes could not tell, narrow stunted bands that whisper of summers too short to feed the roots. Each ring a year of waiting. From Siberia to Peru, that same pattern repeats. Across continents and languages, the message is one. The warmth had gone out of the world. Families began to burn what little they had. Furniture became firewood, icons, altars, even manuscripts, anything that could hold flame, offered up to keep a single night's warmth. But the air itself seemed to resist the fire. Smoke hung low, trapped beneath the strange, heavy sky. The cold did not kill quickly. It lingered, slow, deliberate, and in that slowness, despair grew. In England, a monk recorded that the sea itself had turned cruel. The tides move strange, he wrote, and the fish are few. In the north, rivers froze solid, sealing away the only clean water for miles. Villages starved not only from hunger but from thirst, and when spring should have returned, it brought nothing, only sleet that fell like ash. It was not the kind of suffering that comes with thunder and storm. It was quiet, unending, the kind that teaches people to stop expecting change. Somewhere in the Alps, a mother carries her child through snow that should have melted months ago. The world around her is white and silent, except for the soft creak of ice beneath her boots. The child sleeps, wrapped in cloth that smells faintly of smoke. She does not know if the next valley holds warmth or ruin, but she walks anyway. Each step is an act of faith, not in gods, but in dawn. Far away, in a stone monastery, a monk dips his quill into ink and writes, "The cold did not kill us, the waiting did." He does not know her name, but they are both part of the same story. Two small figures in a world without seasons. The data we have now paints that grief with precision. Tree rings narrow, ice cores thicken with sulfur. Sediments in lakes show sudden bloom and then silence. Algae thriving for 1 year, gone the next. Paleoclimate reconstructions reveal what the monks could not. Global temperature fell by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius. That number sounds small, but it's the difference between rain and snow, harvest and hunger, life and absence. Even in the high Andes, the glaciers grew, creeping downward into valleys where they had not been in centuries. The earth itself seemed to draw in, folding into a long, cold breath. In the cities, people blamed gods and rulers alike. Priests lit fires in empty temples, offering prayers for the return of the sun. Astrologers looked for omens, comets, eclipses, the faint glow of a star burning too bright. But science tells another version. Sulfur aerosols from the eruption had blocked sunlight, altering wind patterns, starving monsoons. This was not divine wrath, but physics, impersonal, relentless, complete. Still, knowing that now changes nothing of what it felt like then. The fear was the same. The hunger was the same. Archaeologists uncover famine pits from this era. Long trenches where bodies were buried quickly, without markers. In Scandinavia, entire settlements vanish from the record after 536. One excavation in Sweden revealed homes abandoned mid-meal, bowls left half-filled, doors left open, as though the people had simply walked into the snow and never returned. And yet, even amid loss, there are signs of endurance. Graves where the dead were laid carefully, side by side, hands touching. Fires rebuilt each morning, even when there was little left to burn. It is easy to imagine them breaking, but they didn't. They endured, quietly. Across the ocean, the Maya carved fewer stelae. The inscriptions grew short, sparse, uncertain. Drought had come, the sky refusing rain. Rivers receded, crops shriveled, temples fell silent. In their glyphs, we read the same fear written across the world, the fear of waiting, of not knowing when life will resume. Whether in the jungles of Central America or the monasteries of Europe, humanity had entered the same season of suspense, waiting. That was the true enemy, the endless dawns that looked no different from the days before, the slow drip of hunger, the endless prayer for change. It was not death that terrified them. It was the rhythm of a life that no longer led anywhere. Imagine waking every morning and seeing the same grey light, the same barren field, the same quiet air that holds no promise. Time stops meaning growth. It becomes survival measured by breaths. Centuries later, when scientists cut through Arctic ice and measure the frozen air of that age, they are not just counting particles. They are hearing echoes of waiting, the chemistry of fear, sealed in ice. Every bubble tells the same story. A world holding its breath, and within that frozen air lies evidence of all who endured it. The farmers, the monks, the mothers, the children. The earth keeps their memory in silence. It's strange how catastrophe unites the living. Even across continents, even separated by oceans, humanity suffered together, unknowingly bound by the same cold wind. A Byzantine merchant praying for sunlight in Constantinople shared the same fear as a Mayan farmer watching his fields wither. Both stared upward at the same pale sun. Both whispered the same question. When will it end? Years passed before the sky began to brighten again. But by then, the damage was already written into history. The hunger, the migrations, the quiet end of dynasties. Empires that once seemed eternal collapsed not from war, but from waiting. And when warmth finally returned, it was not greeted with joy, but suspicion. For how can you trust the sun after it has betrayed you? We speak of natural disasters as moments, explosions, quakes, storms, but the deadliest catastrophes are the slow ones, the kind that whisper instead of roar, the kind that teach humanity the hardest lesson, that survival is not victory, only endurance. So the monks kept writing, the farmers kept sowing, the mothers kept walking through snow, because even when the seasons vanished, hope did not. It lived quietly, in firelight, in breath, in the fragile warmth between two hands held close. And though the world froze, it did not end. It simply waited, patient, silent, trembling, for the sun to remember them again. The cold had thinned the world, hollowed it out. Fields lay bare, wells froze over, empires grew quiet beneath skies that still refused to brighten. And just when humanity began to rise again, weak, hungry, trembling, the second shadow came. Not from the sky this time, but from within. The year was 541. 5 winters had passed since the sun dimmed. The earth had begun to stir again, but slowly, cautiously, as if afraid to wake. And in the heart of that fragile dawn, the plague arrived. Constantinople was the greatest city in the world then, gold domes catching what little light remained, marble streets echoing with merchants' calls, the smell of spice and salt drifting from the harbours. Here, the empire still believed in its endurance. Here, the Emperor Justinian ruled beneath mosaics of saints and stars. But endurance too has its breaking point. The first ships came quietly. They carried grain from Egypt, the lifeblood of the empire. But in the hold, unseen, something else moved. Rats, fleas, the invisible cargo of an invisible enemy. At first, it was a whisper, a fever here, a cough there, a sailor found dead in the morning, his skin darkened by strange shadows beneath the flesh. Then, in days, the whisper became a wail. Bodies filled the streets faster than they could be buried. The sound of the city changed, from the clatter of carts to the low hum of mourning. The chronicler Procopius wrote that men died as if struck down by unseen arrows. He described the swellings, buboes rising beneath, the arms and groin black as ink. He wrote that the emperor himself fell ill, hovering between life and death, while priests burned incense to mask the smell of rot. In every district, the plague spread like rumour, quick, unstoppable, merciless. The people of Constantinople had already lived through the winter of darkness. They had seen the sun vanish and return. But this was different. This was an enemy that came not from the heavens, but from the breath of their neighbours. The cold had tested endurance. The plague tested faith. Imagine the harbour, ships stand still, ropes creaking softly against the tide. No sailors shout, no oars move, only gulls circle above the masts, crying into silence. On the shore, fires burn day and night, not for warmth, but for purification. The priests walk slowly, swinging censers heavy with myrrh and frankincense, their smoke curling into the wind. But the scent cannot hide the truth. Death has a weight that no fragrance can lift. Inside homes, the fever spreads from bed to bed. Mothers pray over their children, the old whisper psalms. Outside, the streets echo with the rolling of carts, wooden wheels carrying the newly dead toward the sea. Procopius wrote that graves filled faster than they could be dug, that corpses were stacked in towers, sealed behind walls. At night the cries faded, and only the wind remained. The same wind that had once carried ash from volcanoes now carried the sighs of the dying. Modern science tells us what they could not know. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same ancient organism that would, centuries later, bring the Black Death, was already here. Its DNA lies preserved in the bones of those who perished. In mass graves near the Sea of Marmara, in the hills of Bavaria, in the riverbeds of Gaul, scientists have found its trace. It travelled with trade, hidden in the warmth of fur, the fur of rats that fed on human grain. A network of commerce became a network of contagion. The Silk Road, the Nile, the Aegean, all turned into threads of sickness binding the world together. But to the people of that time, such knowledge was impossible. They searched for meaning instead. Was this God's punishment? A final trial after the winter's cruelty? Or had the veil of ash somehow poisoned the air, lingering even as the skies cleared? Priests filled the cathedrals, chanting through the night. Doctors burned herbs, prayed over water, traced sigils across the skin. Every action was half faith, half desperation. And still, the fever burned. The earth grew cold, wrote one monk in Egypt, but fire lived in the blood of men. He understood something beyond science, how nature's balance often swings between opposites. The world that froze now burned from within. It was as though the planet, in cooling, had driven its heat into the flesh of its inhabitants. The earth exhaled ash. Humanity exhaled fever. In the face of death, meaning became the last defense. Stories began to form. Whispers of saints who healed, of relics that glowed, of visions seen in the light of candles. One tale spoke of a hermit who walked through infected villages untouched, his shadow healing those it crossed. Another of a mother who nursed her children through the sickness and lived to see the sun return. Whether true or not did not matter. Stories became warmth. They carried faith where reason could not. Outside the city walls, silence stretched. The fields, already empty from famine, grew wild. Dogs wandered through abandoned markets, feeding on what was left. And in the palaces, the same fear that haunted peasants haunted kings. The empire did not fall that year, but something within it cracked. Trade faltered, armies thinned, confidence, that invisible glue of civilization, began to dissolve. A generation later, the map of the Mediterranean looked different. Borders shrank, populations vanished, and yet, even in the ashes of loss, the idea of Rome still flickered, because humanity rarely forgets itself entirely. Even at its weakest, it imagines tomorrow. Modern historians estimate that nearly half the population of Constantinople died. Tens of millions across 3 continents followed, but no number captures the silence left behind. The historian of faith might call it purification. The scientist might call it consequence. The storyteller calls it survival. For though the plague burned through bodies, it also reshaped the way we saw the world. Afterward, people no longer trusted the eternal. They learned that empires could die, that sunlight could fade, that breath itself could betray, and yet they kept breathing. In Alexandria, monks copied medical treatises, believing that knowledge itself could save souls. In Gaul, survivors buried their dead beside rivers, marking the graves with stones carved in the shape of suns. In Jerusalem, prayers were whispered not for deliverance, but for endurance. It was as if the human spirit, too, had learned to live beneath a veil of ash, of fear, of faith. When scientists from the 21st century extracted DNA from the teeth of plague victims buried in Bavaria, they found the ancient ancestor of the Black Death, proof that this was where it began. A single mutation, carried through time like a whisper, linking one era of suffering to another. But they also found something else in those graves. Signs of care. Bodies arranged with tenderness, flowers pressed into folds of cloth, beads still looped around necks. Even in apocalypse, compassion remained. That is perhaps the deepest truth of all. The earth may cool, the sky may darken, the body may burn, but the human heart keeps searching for meaning. When death surrounded them, people did what they had always done. They told stories. They told of saints and miracles, of divine mercy, of light hidden behind clouds. They sang softly in churches that echoed with mourning. They lit candles, not because they believed the light would last, but because it felt right to try. And in those gestures, small, defiant, human, the plague met its match. For faith is not the opposite of fear. It is the rhythm that continues beneath it, the heartbeat that refuses silence. The plague had stolen breath, but not voice. And from that quiet new hymns rose. They were songs of grief, yes, but also of endurance. Songs that said, "We are still here." So the world turned again. The ash faded, the fever cooled, life returned, hesitant but present, as it always does. The same earth that brought ruin also brought recovery. In its balance of destruction and renewal, the planet reminded humanity of its place, not above nature, but within it. And when spring finally came, its warmth felt fragile, holy, undeserved. The people of 541 had survived both the cold and the fever. They had seen the world end twice, and yet it continued. They would never know what we know now, that their suffering traced the birth of something larger, a cycle that would echo through centuries, carrying lessons of humility and hope. The earth cooled, the cities burned, but through both, a single truth endured. Meaning is our most ancient survival instinct. For some disasters, recovery comes in years, for others in centuries. The great dimming of 536 was both, a shadow cast across generations. Even as warmth slowly returned to the earth, the memory of darkness remained. It lingered in fields stripped bare, in the silence of vanished towns, in the stories whispered beside dwindling fires. And in that silence, the old world ended. Not with collapse, but with transformation. Historians call what followed the Dark Ages. They mean it as a metaphor, for lost knowledge, fallen empires, centuries without certainty. But for those who lived it, the darkness was real. They had seen the sun vanish, felt summers colder than winters. The name fit more literally than anyone intended. In the years after the veil descended, empires began to crumble like frost-bitten stone. The Avars, who once ruled the steppes with iron and speed, saw their power falter. The Goths, who had carved kingdoms from the bones of Rome, found their numbers dwindling, their fields turning barren. By the middle of the 6th century, the map of Europe had begun to shift, quietly, inexorably. It was not war that erased these powers, but hunger. Armies march on grain, not glory, and when the harvests failed, so did ambition. In Constantinople, where marble still gleamed faintly through the fog of memory, the empire of Justinian shrank into itself. The grand project of reconquering the West, of restoring Rome, dissolved under the weight of famine, plague, and exhaustion. What had once been an empire of conquest became an empire of endurance. The chroniclers do not describe the moment the dream ended. They only describe the quiet that followed. Across the world, people began to move. Migrations rippled outward like slow waves of human breath. From the steppes of Central Asia to the forests of Northern Europe, tribes sought warmth and food, following rivers, chasing seasons that no longer came. These were not migrations of conquest, but of survival, families carrying what little they had left, crossing frozen plains beneath grey skies that offered no promise of spring. In their footprints, a new geography was written, one not of empire, but of endurance. In China, where imperial order had endured for centuries, the cold carved its own lessons. Farmers began to change what they planted. Millet gave way to barley, barley to hardier strains of wheat. Rice retreated southward, following warmth. From the old texts, climatologists trace this adaptation through the record of tribute and tax. Where once silk and grain flowed north, now came salt, fish, and metal, the economy shifting to survive a cooler, more uncertain climate. The Tang dynasty, which would one day rise to glory, was still a dream. But in the soil and trade of this cold age, the seeds of that rebirth were already taking root. And in the far north, where winters stretched endlessly, the darkness birthed something else entirely. Myth. In the sagas that would later become Norse legend, echoes of this age remain, worlds covered in frost, suns swallowed by wolves, the gods waiting for a final dawn that never comes. Perhaps the stories of Fimbul Winter, the great winter that precedes the end of days, were not prophecy at all, but memory, a cultural scar passed through centuries of retelling. In these frozen myths, humanity made meaning of its coldest truth, that even when the sun fails, life must continue. Modern experts see this age not as decline, but as transformation. In a laboratory at Uppsala University, a climatologist studies ice cores under sterile light. Within those translucent columns, she reads the history of that long shadow: sulfur, carbon, pollen, a frozen record of both death and adaptation. Each layer tells a story: volcanic dust fading, forests regrowing, new crops emerging in place of old. The data, she says, shows not collapse, but change. At Cambridge, a historian maps migration patterns, tracing how climate redefined culture. When food became scarce, people moved. When people moved, languages met. When languages met, ideas changed. The chain reaction of necessity forged a new world, smaller, hungrier, wiser. And yet, for those who lived through it, there was no sense of renewal, only endurance. The dark skies above, the empty fields below, and the long ache of uncertainty in between. A monk in Ireland wrote that the world is cold, and the hearts of men colder still. But perhaps he mistook exhaustion for apathy, because beneath that exhaustion, something was forming, a quiet resilience, a deeper kind of faith. When the seasons no longer obeyed, people learned to trust what could not be taken: ritual, memory, story. The myths that emerged in this age, of sleeping gods, of fire beneath ice, were not escapism. They were survival. They gave shape to chaos, turning cold into symbol, hunger into lesson. In their frostbitten logic, there was comfort. If endless winter had a reason, then so did endurance. From the snows of Scandinavia to the plains of Mongolia, storytellers reimagined the cold not as curse, but as test. And when warmth finally returned, the world that rose was no longer the same. Archaeologists see this transformation in the smallest of things. Grain found stored in clay jars, adapted for colder soil. Homes rebuilt with thicker walls. Communities gathered closer together, the artifacts of survival, not empire. In some sites, charcoal layers show a curious pattern: controlled burns, intentional clearing. Even amid famine, people were reshaping the land, reclaiming control inch by inch. It wasn't a golden age, but it was an age of rebuilding. And in its patience, the first foundations of the medieval world were set. The Dark Ages, that name, once uttered with disdain, begins to look different through this lens. Yes, knowledge was lost. Yes, cities crumbled. But beneath that loss was adaptation, slow, subtle, resilient. It was not darkness alone. It was gestation, a cold world forcing humanity to simplify, to remember what mattered most: food, faith, fire, and story. The roots of Europe's later flowering, art, science, reason, grew from this frozen soil. Even now the ice remembers. Cores drilled deep into Greenland and Antarctica carry the chemical fingerprints of this age, the echo of that first eruption, the dust of a forgotten fire. Climatologists trace them like constellations, linking ancient despair to modern understanding. They know now that the long shadow lasted more than a century. The Earth's temperature depressed, its systems trembling toward balance, and yet life continued through every degree of loss. The historian Kyle Harper calls it a hinge of climate and civilization, a moment when the planet reminded humanity of its dependence. On forces beyond comprehension, the world cooled, but thought deepened. By the 7th century, the cold began to ease. New kingdoms emerged where old ones had fallen. The Slavs and Bulgars rose in the Balkans. The Franks solidified power in Gaul. The Silk Road reopened under new rulers, carrying not only trade, but memory. The lessons of scarcity translated into policy and prayer. In China, the return of warmth sparked population growth and invention. In the north, long nights birthed sagas that would outlive their tellers by 1,000 years. The long shadow began to lift, but its shape remained etched in culture, language, belief. Perhaps every age of darkness is not an ending, but an instruction. The cold stripped the world bare, revealing what could endure. Empires fell, but communities grew closer. Faith deepened. Stories multiplied. Even fear found its purpose: to remind humanity that nothing is guaranteed and everything is precious. The Dark Ages were not merely a fall. They were a kind of rebirth, a quiet awakening in frost. When modern scientists hold a vial of ancient ice and say, "This was the year the world dimmed," They are not simply measuring temperature. They are touching the memory of transformation. And when we listen to those voices of chroniclers, farmers, mothers, kings, we hear not despair, but persistence. The whisper beneath the wind that says, we adapted, we endured, we began again. The world remembers more than we think, not just in books or ruins, but in the air itself, in the dust we breathe, in the echoes that linger between centuries. The winter of 536 ended long ago, yet its shadow has never truly faded. It lingers in patterns of climate, in art, in fear, in awe. Each new eruption, each dimming of the sun, carries the same whisper. We have been here before. The centuries turned, and the earth exhaled again. In 1257, in 1452, in 1600, volcanoes spoke the same ancient language of fire and silence, but none echoed more powerfully than the year 1815. Mount Tambora, in what is now Indonesia, tore itself open with a force 10,000 times that of an atomic blast. Ash climbed into the sky, not for miles, but for weeks. The sun dimmed, and once again, the world fell into a winter that did not belong to its calendar. They called it the year without a summer. 1816. Snow fell in June. Frost lay on fields of wheat. And across Europe and North America, the memory of 536 returned, not as history, but as hunger. In a small Swiss village near Lake Geneva, a group of writers took shelter in a mansion against the endless rain. Among them was a young woman named Mary. She watched the sky stay grey for months, lightning crawling over the lake like veins of silver. It was that unnatural darkness, that storm without end, that inspired her to imagine another kind of creation. Her monster, born from death, shaped by light and thunder. She called him Frankenstein, art from ash, beauty drawn from fear. In another village, far from Geneva, the same rain destroyed the harvest. Cows died, their bones sold for candles. Children dug for roots that no longer grew. The cold returned in waves, relentless, as though the earth were mourning something it had lost centuries ago. And yet, amid the hunger, people adapted. Again, they changed what they planted. They built greenhouses. They shared warmth. The same instincts that had carried their ancestors through 536 stirred once more. Endurance, cooperation, story. In London, the artist J.M.W. Turner watched the same skies that had terrified peasants in the Alps. But where others saw despair, he saw colour. He painted sunsets that burned like molten glass, streaks of gold and crimson, echoes of volcanic light diffused through ash. To him, the dimmed sun was not tragedy, but transformation. Science would later prove him right. Volcanic aerosols scatter light in strange ways, bending colour into brilliance. Turner's skies, once thought romantic exaggeration, were in fact accurate. Atmospheric physics turned into paint. The same veil that darkened crops had illuminated art. Not far away, the River Thames froze. It had frozen before, but never quite like this. In the early years of the Little Ice Age, centuries earlier, it had become a carnival. The frost fairs, they called them. Vendors sold roasted chestnuts and hot wine upon the ice. Children played where boats once sailed. For a brief moment, suffering became celebration. That is humanity's oldest trick, turning calamity into ritual and ritual into meaning. The frozen river became a stage upon which endurance itself was performed. And when the ice melted, the memory stayed. The Little Ice Age lasted from the 14th to the 19th centuries, a long, uneven twilight. It was not a single winter, but a temperament of the world. Glaciers advanced. Harvests failed and recovered, failed again. Kingdoms rose and fell to the rhythm of cold. In the Alps, whole villages were swallowed by creeping ice. In China, rivers that had not frozen in memory turned to glass. In the Andes, farmers built terraces to capture sunlight where they could. Each generation thought their suffering unique. But in the silence of the glaciers, the memory of 536 stirred, faint, patient, unforgotten. Then, in 1883, Krakatoa, a sound so loud it circled the world 4 times. Skies turned copper, then blood red. Painters again looked up and saw beauty instead of terror. Poets wrote of sunsets that glowed as if the world were ending. And perhaps, in a way, it was. Not the end of civilization, but of certainty. Every time the sky dimmed, humanity remembered its fragility. And every time it created something to endure it. Stories, prayers, art. Neuroscience offers an explanation. When we dream, our brains replay fear in the safety of illusion. It is how we prepare ourselves to face the world again. Storytelling does the same, not for sleep alone, but for survival. We tell stories of catastrophe before we rest, not because we love the darkness, but because it comforts us to give it shape. By naming it, we tame it. By imagining its end, we remind ourselves that we can awaken. This is why bedtime stories so often hover between nightmare and lullaby, because the human mind finds peace, not in ignorance of danger, but in mastery of it. We survive by remembering. Memory, after all, is a form of warmth. In quiet moments, when modern life hums with light and noise, it is easy to forget how close we live to that edge still. The same volcanoes sleep beneath the same seas. The same winds circle the same fragile planet. The same sun shines, brilliant and indifferent. But we remember, through myth, through record, through art, through stories like this one, told softly in the dark. It is not morbid to remember, it is merciful, because in remembering, we build empathy for those who endured before us, and patience for those who will endure after. When the ash of Krakatoa settled, the skies over Europe stayed strange for years. Turner was gone by then, but others painted in his shadow. Munch, standing in Oslo, saw one of those sunsets, the sky bleeding red over the fjord. He felt something tremble inside him, something between terror and beauty. He painted the scream. Again, art rising where fear had fallen. Again, beauty drawn from ash. We might think of these moments, 5M36, Tambora, Krakatoa, as isolated, but they are not. They are verses of the same long poem the earth has been writing since before we walked upon it. Each eruption, each winter, each dimming sky adds another line to that story. And we, the listeners, carry the rhythm forward. That rhythm is not one of despair. It is of persistence, of survival, written through memory. Psychologists say that every retelling of trauma reshapes it slightly, softens its edges, gives it context. In that process, pain becomes knowledge, fear becomes myth, and myth becomes strength. The stories of ancient darkness were never meant to frighten. They were meant to comfort, to say, this has happened before, and we are still here. So we keep telling them, by firelight, by candle, by screen. Each story is a small warmth against the long cold of forgetting. Each memory a spark in the frozen air. We cannot stop the earth from trembling, nor the skies from dimming again. But we can remember what it felt like, and in remembering we remain human. The night grows quiet now. The wind that once carried ash carries only its echo, and though centuries have passed since that first darkened sun, its light still flickers in us, in the art we make, the faith we hold, the stories we whisper before sleep. Because even the longest winter ends, and memory, in its own way, is the fire that carries us through. There is a silence that follows every storm, not empty but full of reflection. It is the hush after survival, when breath becomes gratitude and time regains its rhythm. The long winter has ended, yet its lessons linger like frost on the window of memory. The question remains, what did the cold teach us? In the years after the darkness of 536, humanity began again, planting, rebuilding, retelling. The world thawed, but the memory of silence did not fade. It lived in stories, in warnings, in rituals whispered across generations. And somewhere within those fragments, a truth emerged. We did not endure because we were strong. We endured because we shared what warmth we had. Modern science offers its own language for what the ancients felt. We now speak of feedback loops, of albedo and sulfur aerosols, of climate forcing and volcanic perturbation. We have satellites that measure the faintest tremor of a cloud. We can map the carbon breath of a forest, the heartbeat of a glacier. Yet the heart of the lesson remains unchanged. That the earth is not a backdrop, but a partner, and when it trembles, so do we. The cold of 536 was not the last, nor will it be. The same fragility echoes today in different forms. In rising seas, in melting permafrost, in the faint chemical fingerprints of our own making. Where once the sun dimmed because of ash, now it may dim because of us. We are no longer the helpless witnesses of a cosmic accident. We are its participants. Still, the emotion is the same. That quiet, ancient fear of losing the light. The fear that tomorrow's sunrise might come weaker, duller, or not at all. And so we look again for meaning. Not in dominance, but in understanding. A climatologist once said, We survived not through strength, but through sharing fire. It was not poetry. It was fact. In the cold, strength is brittle. What endures is connection. The shared breath, the offered flame, the unspoken pact that we will not let one another freeze. The fire that saved us in 536 was not just heat. It was the fire of story, of empathy, of cooperation. It flickered in monasteries where monks copied the same few books to keep knowledge alive. It burned in villages where families gathered close, not because they trusted the future, but because they trusted each other. Today, that lesson feels more urgent than ever. Our threats are no longer just volcanic or celestial. They are human-shaped, technological, systemic. And yet, the psychology of survival has not changed. When the power fails, when the grid falters, when the world outside grows hostile, the first instinct is still to gather light, to find warmth, even symbolic, and share it. We light candles not only to see, but to say, we are not alone. The mythic patterns that followed the cold are proof of that yearning. Norse sagas spoke of Fimbulwinter, the great freeze before the world's end. Christian texts described an age of shadow before the second coming. Asian chronicles told of dragons blotting out the sun. Each story, in its own way, was a translation of trauma, a way to make the incomprehensible feel moral, purposeful, survivable. It is human nature to mythologize pain until it becomes wisdom. We cannot control volcanoes or plagues, but we can frame them. And framing, in its quiet way, is an act of peace. The scientists who study ancient ice still speak with reverence, even when they speak in data. In the frozen layers of Greenland and Antarctica, they read the story of every eruption, every shift in the planet's pulse. Each line of trapped air is a breath from another age, a fragment of the silence that almost ended us. One researcher from Uppsala once said in an interview, "It's humbling to hold a piece of ice older than civilization. You realize how brief we are, and yet how persistent." That humility is the truest lesson of the cold, that survival is not conquest. It is coexistence. It is the willingness to live gently in a world that does not owe us balance. Our ancestors did not know why the sun dimmed. We do. And yet knowledge has not erased vulnerability. It has only illuminated it. We understand how thin the veil is between warmth and ruin. We measure it in degrees, in particles, in years. And still, it terrifies us, not because we cannot explain it, but because now we know we can cause it. Nuclear winter, geoengineering, climate collapse, all new phrases for an old memory. The fear that the sky might again grow pale, and humanity might again wonder if spring will return. Yet even here, in our age of technology and tension, the ancient rhythm continues. We adapt, we create, we remember. In laboratories and documentaries, in art and activism, in quiet conversations whispered before sleep, we retell the same lesson, that every era of cold is also an era of awakening. The philosopher's truth remains simple. The earth will continue long after us, but our small kindnesses can ripple through its storms. When the cold comes again, in whatever form it takes, it will not test our strength. It will test our tenderness. In 536, the world nearly lost its memory of light. Yet from that darkness grew civilizations rebuilt on shared hope, new religions, new trade routes, new myths that bound people together in purpose. Out of scarcity came compassion. Out of silence came song. The same cycle continues now, quietly, in ways we might not yet see. Each time we adapt to a changing climate, or reach across borders in the wake of disaster, we rehearse the same survival instinct that saved our ancestors. It is not technology alone that preserves us, but empathy written in the bones of our species. We like to think progress means escape, that science will lift us beyond nature's reach. But perhaps the truer wisdom is balance, not control, to understand the world enough to respect it, to remember that even knowledge, like fire, must be tended gently. Every civilization that forgets this eventually rediscovers it, through ash, through famine, through frost. The cycle is not a curse. It is a conversation. The earth speaks. We learn, then we forget. Then we remember, again and again. As night deepens, the lesson of the cold feels almost like a lullaby. Slow, circular, comforting in its inevitability. The world cools, the world warms, and we find our place in between. The key is not to conquer the rhythm, but to listen to it, because listening is its own form of survival. So let us end softly, where all endurance begins, not with fear, but with humility, with the quiet acceptance that we belong to something larger, older, and wiser than ourselves, and that our true strength lies not in defiance of the cold, but in the warmth we share through it. For as one climatologist reminded us, we survived not through strength, but through sharing fire. And that truth, gentle as breath, is what will keep us alive when the world grows cold again. At first it was only a whisper, a faint shift in the air, so soft that those who noticed it doubted themselves. The wind, which had carried only the voice of ice for years, began to move differently, gentler, uncertain, as though remembering an older song. Snow that had lain stubborn and unbroken began to darken at the edges, and then one morning, beneath a sky still pale with memory, water began to move. It did not rush or roar, it simply flowed. The long winter was ending. No one marked the exact day. There was no calendar left that could. But across continents, from the ruins of farms to the high ridges where travellers had once prayed for light, the thaw began. Frozen rivers cracked open with a sound like distant thunder. The first shoots of green appeared, fragile but defiant, breaking through soil that had forgotten how to give. Birds returned hesitantly, testing the silence with song. And everywhere, breath rose not as frost, but as mist. Warm, living, human. After so much stillness, even the smallest motion felt miraculous. People who had spent years beneath grey skies watched the horizon and wept, not because of what they saw, but because they could see again. The sun, once feared to have abandoned them, climbed higher each day. Its light was weak at first, filtered through the remnants of the volcanic veil, but it was light, golden, unpromised, real. Life began to return in slow mosaics. The farmers of Gaul planted again, though the soil still carried the taste of ash. In the Byzantine countryside, vines were coaxed back to life. In China, the scribes noted that the strange dimming had finally lifted. And in the north, where glaciers had lingered longest, moss crept across stones that had been bare for a generation. The earth remembered how to heal itself. Patiently, without rush. Forests grew where once there had been desolation. Rivers redrew their courses. The balance that had been broken began cautiously to return. And through it all, humanity watched and learned the slow rhythm of renewal. No one spoke openly of the years of cold. It was too vast, too unspeakable. But they carried its lessons quietly, in ritual, in gratitude, in prayer. They built their homes closer together, as if proximity itself could keep away the dark. They stored grain, and with it, stories, of the time when the sun vanished, and warmth had to be found within. It is in this way that civilizations recover, not with triumph, but with tenderness. Not through conquest, but through the quiet decision to begin again. Centuries later, when historians looked back, they gave names to what had happened. The Great Volcanic Winter, the Age of Ash, the beginning of the Dark Ages. But those who lived through it did not name it at all. To them it was simply the time when the light was lost, and then the time when it returned. Perhaps that is the purest way to understand survival, not as victory, but as continuity. To have endured is not to have conquered, it is simply to have remained long enough to see the thaw. In every age since, we have carried echoes of that renewal. Every spring, when frost recedes and rivers awaken, we reenact the same astonishment, that life continues, that colour returns, that after silence comes song. Even now, centuries later, that pattern persists in our bones. We celebrate spring as if we remember something ancient, not the memory of one winter, but of all winters. It is the body's quiet ritual of gratitude. We made it through the dark. When we look back upon those who survived 536, we often see them through the lens of tragedy, famine, plague, collapse. But there is another truth, quieter and more enduring. They were the ancestors of resilience. They passed through years without light and carried on. They whispered to their children of a time when the sun hid, and the children listened and believed that it would always return. Their faith was not naive. It was biological. It was the pulse of the human spirit refusing to still. Some say the soul of humanity is fire. Others say it is memory. Perhaps it is both. A small, persistent warmth carried forward through generations, surviving every freeze. When the cold came, that flame did not roar or consume. It flickered quietly in the darkness, enough to guide, enough to endure. And that is what the long winter truly taught us, that the human heart does not seek victory over nature, but harmony within it, that we live, not despite the cold, but because of what it reminds us, that every dawn is borrowed and every warmth shared. Imagine now, as we close, the world waking again. The valleys fill with mist, not smoke. The rivers hum their old songs. A forest trembles under the touch of morning wind. In that wind, the last ash of the old world scatters, returning to the soil as quiet nourishment. Above it all, the sun, no longer dim, no longer doubted, climbs through the sky with the calm authority of a survivor. Its light touches every frozen memory, softens every scar, reveals how much beauty remained hidden in the stillness. Somewhere, in the hush before full day, a bird begins to sing. It is not the first bird of spring, nor the most beautiful, but it is enough. Its voice carries over thawing ground, across fields that once lay barren, through ruins softened by moss. It carries the simplest truth the world has ever known, that darkness ends, that life waits, that warmth, once lost, can always be found again. And as we listen, across centuries, across distance, we realize that the story was never only about catastrophe. It was always about endurance, about the quiet, ordinary miracle of continuation. The cold came and we stayed. The light faded and we remembered it until it returned. That is all survival truly means. Now, as the tale closes, breathe. The air no longer carries ash. The horizon no longer hides. You are here, warm, alive, part of a lineage that has endured every long night the earth has ever known. Every dawn we see is borrowed from that ancient darkness, a gift from those who refused to let the fire die. Their warmth lives in ours. Their faith becomes our morning. So let the story end not with fear, but with stillness. The wind eases. The frost melts from the last leaf. Somewhere, water drips from a branch, and the sound is soft, like breath, like renewal. The world exhales, and in that silence, the one that comes not before the storm, but after it, we rest, not in darkness but in awe,